Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare podcast. With me today are Murray Dom, the assistant editor of the magazine, Mark McCaffrey, Mark DeSantis, Lindsay Powell, and I am Jasper Orthuis. I am the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine. And today we're discussing the latest issue of the magazine, which is on the way to subscribers and anybody who pre-ordered it worldwide. I think it's got to most places in the world already. Even to Australia.
It even got down here.
Picks it up. And the topic of that issue is challenges of campaigning. And we established in our sort of pre-discussion, as well as in the magazine, that is a potentially huge topic. I mean, you can go from logistics to topography to intelligence to dealing with the troops. And that's a topic that we did not really discuss in the magazine very much. It's like, how does a general get his army to do what he wants them to do when they are perhaps hesitant or unwilling to do that? And that might be a good question to kick off with. Throw the ball out there. Who's going to catch it?
Well, I suppose I'll start off, and then I always say things that are controversial, and then other people go, hang on a minute. I think probably the most famous example is Julius Caesar, obviously landing in Britain, throwing the standard bearer of the 10th Legion, throwing the standard, intending that the legionaries go and get it, appealing to pride and making, that first landing possible. But the example that I always like to bring up as a counter to that is that at the Battle of Pydna, in the earliest phases of the battle, that same trick is attempted, that the standard bearer throws the standard into the Macedonian phalanx of Perseus, and the Romans cannot break the Macedonian phalanx to get the standard back. So it is that motivator of, you need to go and rescue the standard, you need to go and get the flag. Of course, they eventually win the Battle of Pydna, and therefore we don't hear about that standard being lost. So presumably they did recover it. But that idea of appealing to unit pride, for lack of a better term, that idea of the national pride, that you don't want to have the embarrassment or the shame of having lost the standard. At various different points, you've got psychology and reverse psychology being used for generals motivating troops to stand firm. We've got, I think, Sulla and Caesar at various points, even Pompey, I think, going to fight in the front line as a way of shaming the troops that their general would need to, which is, of course, a complete reversal of, for instance, Greek hoplite battle, where it's expected that the general fight in the front line. Again, Alexander the Great leads his charges from the front of the companion cavalry. So there's that setting the example version of leadership that you've got there, where the men follow their general because their general shows them how to do it. And that's the way Xenophon and I think Onosander say a general should be. They should be better than their men at the tasks they're asking their men to do. And then later, you get the Roman pattern of generalship, which is generally generalship from the rear, for lack of a better term. So there's that telling your men what to do, and the inspiring speeches are everywhere, even when it's impossible that the writer heard the speech. Like we have Boudicca's speech before the battles in 61. You're like, did he speak Brythonic? I don't think he did. I don't think anyone survived long enough to tell him what was said by Boudicca on her chariot. Was she on a chariot, really? Was she? So all of those sorts of things are a common trait, and that's another issue for the historian, really. Challenges of historianing, that you get these stories in the historians, and when you actually start to unpack them, it's very unlikely they ever happened in the way we're told. But there is various different models for commanders of different kinds motivating troops to perform, and mostly those are challenging moments. They're not, the opening of the battle when armies do what they're expected to do and deploy the way they're expected to deploy. It's always when things get tough and, soldiers are wavering.
There are two things that strike me, because effectively what the job of the leader stroke manager is to get the work done, right? That's the job of any leader, any manager to do. And you would imagine, I'm going to talk about the Roman army, they will have a conference before the battle happens. There'll be the concilium where the legate or whoever the senior commander is, and they'll pull in the tribunes and they'll pull in the various ranks of centurions, and they will discuss strategy. They will decide how the battle plan is going to work. And then presumably on the day, then you get this address to the troops, the ad contio, if you will. And it's always struck me as being, how does that work? How does one voice carry on a battlefield with like 5,400, maybe 6,200 men with wind blowing and all the rest of it? So you have to hope that the people at the meeting the day before have their instructions and will carry them out. And because the span of authority allows them some leeway when, you can't work out all the details when rubber hits road, as it were. So the speech that the leader gives, I wonder if it's a kind of, it's a motivational thing just for the point of, our man is out the front and he's going to lead the charge kind of idea. What he says, most people are never going to hear because the voice is going to blow around in the wind and just a small group are going to find it.
I don't know about that, because you've got the political scene back in Rome, for example, and when you're talking about something, a speech being given in a contio in the forum, there's only a certain distance that any voice is normally going to carry. But then you've got relays happening throughout the crowd and, strategically placed. So you've got that message, the key points, or at least maybe just the catchphrases being grasped and relayed back, etc. So perhaps, taking that happens in the political sphere, maybe that, can be transferred into the military.
I'll come so way on a journey with you. So the forum is going to be fairly enclosed. You've either got the comitium, which is a circular space, or you've got the rostra from somewhere, which is basically a tribunal higher up, and you can talk to a crowd. And actually, the space of the Roman Forum isn't actually wide. I'm just referring back to my experience. So, for example, when I was with the Ermine Street Guard, and our Centurio, our chairman, would try and speak to a group of no more than 35 men at Fishbourne, and you couldn't hear half of what he said.
Yeah, I think that's more in the delivery, though. So, again, I think having spoken to large crowds unamplified, and we probably today don't have the idea because, generally speaking, they'll be handed a microphone. And, we have so many books on the delivery of speech. And when you go to Verona and it's an 80,000 seat amphitheater, you have singers singing unamplified.
Well, that's an amphitheater.
Yes, but 80,000 people in an amphitheater is still getting your voice to go a very long way.
Yeah, but have you been to Epirus? That's 60,000 people.
Yeah, but you can whisper at Epirus.
Yes, because I'm saying that it's a concave space designed where acoustics work in a flat battle space with wind howling and what's his name?
But wind howling, you wouldn't be fighting a battle. I don't know there's any ancient battle with wind howling. It's normally quiet, early morning, Mediterranean weather. It is still, and there is no extraneous noise. And if you have ever tried to talk to a crowd on a flat green grass, your voice carries a much further than you expect it does if you produce it correctly. You've got ranks of serried men,
I remain skeptical.
Not people on picnic blankets. So when I've addressed a crowd of about 15,000 people, they can hear me yell. And they're on picnic blankets. So the reality of that is you can be heard. You're not going to give a rousing speech as per Tacitus or Thucydides because your voice will be gone before you get through.
I've spoken, for example, at the Caroline Amphitheatre, and I've been to, was it Avanches, where they have an amphitheatre, and I've spoken to, but that space is...
But no, I'm talking speaking on an open field, and it can happen. You can be heard, but it's how you do it.
Anybody here is a trained military officer or NCO, but if you hear any of those guys talk in front of a group, it's part of it is practice, and I'm sure that's something that you're referring to, Murray, is you have to been able to deal with it and figure out how your voice carries over distance.
But the underlying problem is how do you convey your plan to everyone?
But it's also I was gonna get back to what Mark said about relays. I'm pretty sure that argument has been made about centurions, that they serve as a relay for the speech or for the orders that are given to the army as a whole. They are just perhaps because they know part of it already, so they can give those commands. That makes them extra important in the battle, in their role in the battle. But I think we're also getting possibly sidetracked into focusing on battles and the issues about campaigning, which is the part before and after the battle. and the question is there, how do you get your army to go into lands they don't know?
Well, you've got the element of religion as well. I mean, it's already been mentioned in terms of Caesar's, throwing of the standard, be that in his most famous throwing of the standard when he's landing in Britain down at the beach of Deal, or I think he's also guilty of having done that one before, that trick. Also, I think it's against the Belgae, one of the Belgae tribes, that he actually throws it over the line. And again, it's the 10th Legion, which goes berserk to retrieve it. But I mean, you've got that religious element because it represents, their main deity. That can be extended to the likes of, for me, it sort of recalls Sartorius, and of course his use of the white fawn when he's in Spain, and of course saying that, pitching it to the troops that this is the goddess favoring me because I've got this tame white fawn following me round upon my beck and call, and therefore inspiring the troop by saying the gods are with us in one way or another, therefore we can go forward with whatever plans that we want, etc. And of course, especially when he's manipulating the delivery of information and delivery of intelligence reports, rather than allowing his troops to actually arrive with these reports to him, he's intercepting them outside of the camp and then having them load them, give them to the deer to actually bring into him on a platter as such. And so the god is reporting to him and giving him secret intelligence. That sort of thing can certainly inspire troops.
Yeah, and I mean that example brings up is it Pisistratus with the tall woman on the chariot pretending to be Athena, and several other incidents where the manipulation of, I mean, even the several battles where Castor and Pollux are supposed to have appeared in the army.
There's another one with Scipio, of course. I think it's Carthage, where he, of course, is attacking across a tidal flats, and of course it's laced with areas of quicksand and whatnot, but he acquires the information from the local fishermen as to where the paths are through the tidal flats, and leads his troops across in a dawn attack, I think it is, and to those, to the rest of the army, because he only takes a small unit with him. To the rest of the army, it is the gods allowing him to go where no man should, across the tidal flats. So again, he's received some sort of memory's fading here. Some sort of title of Poseidon's,
chosen,
chosen as such.
No, it's fascinating. I think, the other one is Julius Caesar. There's an anecdote that they perform the sacrifice, and the sacrificial animal has no heart, which obviously can't happen. But he turns that and says, is it surprising, according to the anecdote, is it surprising that such a wild beast has no heart? And that, apparently turns the army around from being worried and scared to, oh, yeah, our general's got it covered. So I think that inspiring confidence and inspiring choices, because more often than not, the battles are justified through, conquest or retaliation. So there's a much clearer line of, we're going to do this because this is our avenging our brothers, or, avenging. I mean, even if you think about Alexander the Great, the justification we get, even surviving into Diodorus and Arrian, is to avenge the burning of Athens. And so, and even from the Persian perspective, their attack on Athens and Greece is to avenge the burning of Sardis. So those kinds of, hang on, that was 150 years ago. But those sorts of religious justifications in terms of inspiring an army or keeping an army on board, so to speak, seem to be quite peppered throughout the sources. And when you start to think about them, there's more and more.
It's also a personalization in terms of the addressing the soldiers. For example, in terms of the Macedonians, there's references at various points to the Macedonian. Of course, Alexander's forces is a bit of a polyglot force in terms of it's the Macedonian, but it's also got the Greek elements, and then it expands as it goes along, adding other multinational elements. But to appeal to the Macedonians, he of course sends, I think it's Craterus, I think, to actually address them, and it's referred to as he spoke in his Macedonian or in the Macedonian accent, and that's what turned the troops, in their opinion. So it's that identity, the cultural or ethnic identity, being pressed home.
To do with the theme is the challenges of campaigning, and I think in the pre-talk we were talking about the length of time it takes to organize a campaign. I mean, you roll a campaign out for one season, but it might take 1, 2, 3 seasons to actually get to the point where you're ready for it. So my pet example is, for example, the early German war under Augustus taking famously Nero Claudius Drusus into the area on the other side of the Rhine, which was clearly a phased campaign in terms of its execution, but the planning of it was extraordinary. So it started around about 14 BC with the building out of fortresses across the left bank of the Rhine, Neuss, for example. I'm trying to think. Your hometown, Jasper, what's that called? I can't remember.
You're thinking of Nijmegen, not my hometown.
I'm thinking of Nijmegen. Yes, exactly. Sorry, I've been eating curries today, and I've got Indian places on my mind. So the point is that clearly there's an infrastructure dimension to this. There's the training and provisioning of the troops, and all of that presumably is predicated on an understanding of what you're trying to attack. So an article I read, which was actually written in the 30s, where somebody's trying to make the point that, interestingly, all of the forts along the Rhine are pretty much positioned against a tributary of the Rhine on the other side. So what that points to is some strategizing, which is to say, we're going to use the river on the other side as part of our campaign supply chain routing. So it shows the sophistication. So you're not just simply training troops and say attack. You're actually getting them in this position where you reduce the risk of the campaign and therefore elevate its chance of success through all this very elaborate thinking and planning. And I'm sure you look at examples in Alexander the Great's campaign and all the other greats. They sustained it through this immense prior work.
It was much easier for someone such as Alexander to supply his forces if he had access to a river or access to the sea, because you could bring in food that way. It was very difficult to go foraging for such a big army. Either Alexander had to have the districts that he was entering surrender to him and provide food for him ahead of time. This had to happen ahead of time. But if they didn't surrender, if he had to fight his way through trying to conquer, trying to get the food that he needed was going to be next to impossible. So he needed to be able to bring it via river or via the ocean.
And I suspect in the case of Nero Claudius Drusus, there was an understanding, and I can't prove this, but I mean, if you look at Strabo, there are various tropes about what they think Germany looks like, and they would have used the intelligence gathered from merchants and so on, that once they had landed on the other side, they would actually have supply dumps. Rudgen is a good example. And as the campaign would move further up, they would obviously be able to send boats from the Rhine fortresses to the supply dumps and then smaller vessels or land transport at that point, which would then obviously be slower. But it just shows that these things are meticulously thought out. So in the same way that the US Army has, is that like for every one person carrying a gun at the front, there's about 8 or 9 people behind. It almost hints at that sort of level of support as well in a campaign.
Well, essentially, that's what Fishbourne was originally, what is known today as Fishbourne Roman Palace. But of course, the first 2 buildings that were built on the site go back to the invasion period of 43 as a supply dump, possibly even ahead of arrival of the troops, and then supplying them until they pass what eventually became the Staingate. And then, of course, after that point, it no longer is needed, and so therefore it can transition into something else, which eventually becomes the palace itself, given over to the local Celtic chieftain.
Yeah, the preparations for the British campaign are fascinating because, of course, we have several false starts before Claudius, and they are abused in the sources as being not serious. I think possibly they were, but there were challenges that were either not overcome or, the sources get hold of them and then they turn them into a, seashell expedition. I think the more I read, the more bad emperors need to be retconned and good emperors need to be.
Well, I think the archaeology is proving that at the moment in terms of in France, they've found where some of the supply dumps were before Caligula's preparations, and which of course were used by Claudius, and so therefore it does prove that actually he was, there's fairly serious.
That's how he's able to get off the mark relatively quickly. Yeah,
it's one of those things again about bad emperors. Domitian, Nero, command through their subordinates. Good emperors, Trajan, command through their subordinates. You're like, hang on a minute, both are commanding through subordinates. They're not at the front doing the fighting, but the way that Trajan's presented it in Trajan's column, for instance, is very different to the way we talk about Domitian, who was also supposedly at the front in the Dacian wars that he fights in the 80s and 90s. But the other one I was going to come back to just be counter to you, when you can't pre-plan, such as the expedition of the 10,401 BC, you still march through enemy territory, unknown, areas, and you're at the mercy of good guides, bad guides, taking wrong routes to all sorts of interesting things. And so that idea of actually needing to forage. And the fascinating thing about the 10,000 is the losses. So that famously at Cunaxa, they don't lose a man, even though they are on the losing side of the battle. I don't know why, because 10,000 becomes the number that even the ancients refer to the expedition as, even though there's somewhere between 12 and 13,800 men in the 10,000. And so by the end of the expedition, they've lost through attrition and losses many of those men, but I think there's still 8,000 left. It's quite a remarkable achievement to have that many men marching through hostile and unknown territory. Loss. Yeah, that's where the 10,000 becomes weird, because you're like, well, it's only 20% losses, which, given they were probably all given up for dead, is pretty good.
So the one I was going to say, kind of an extension of what you're saying there, Murray, is the campaign of Caius Aelius Gallus to Arabia Felix in 2624, which is celebrated by Augustus because he claims it was a win, but in fact it was very far from a win. So Gallus goes off on this campaign thinking he's got the friend of an Arabian ally, I think it's a Palmyrene. And all the way, he doesn't understand he's being duped. And this guy's actually taking him off on the longest route everywhere. These people are just literally either falling for fever or dehydration. They come up with this concoction that's supposed to cure them. But in fact, all it seems to do is kill their people. And it's a disaster. And in the end, they find out, you mean this place was on the other side of the hill the whole time and you marched up and down? It's extraordinary. So again, it comes down to the quality of the information you have and the guide you pick. And all those are leadership and management decisions.
Sure, but, it's coming back to what you said about the preparations of the Germanic campaign, that planning all those supply depots is only useful if you know what you're after behind that supply depot, because otherwise you have a depot in nothing useful.
Interesting. Sorry, Lindsay, it was also the fact that we say Romans lose. The duping Arabian prince won deliberately through planning, but we then paint it as, no, the Romans should have known better. It's like, no, they were hook, line, and sinkered. Teutoburg is famous.
That was an exactly theme in another podcast. I don't know whether you mentioned it, another one, but the point was, we always think of the Romans losing as opposed to the other side winning. Interesting point. No, I was just going to say that you're quite right. So you also, to Mark's point about having, let's say, in this, it's the case of the Regni or the Atrebates, whichever they're called, that they had obviously got some kind of alliance going with the Romans so that the Romans could land there in the first place. So again, even as far as Augustus, there are British war chiefs, British kings who are going and becoming allies of Romans, so that even Augustus is able to say, well, I actually already have claims over Britain because I've got allies over there. So if you're able to leverage those positions before you get on campaign, that's a very, very positive advantage.
I think it's one of those things we only have suggested as the amount of diplomacy, not only of Roman diplomacy going out, but of barbarian diplomacy coming in. And one of the things I discovered when you look at the Hunnic invasions and even the Germanic invasions, the Goth invasions in the 4th century, in the 5th century, the Huns only seem to invade the Eastern Roman Empire when the Eastern Roman Empire's armies are off fighting somewhere else, or there's some mutiny in the Eastern Roman Empire over pay. And suddenly the Huns appear and there's no army to fight them. And you're like, how did they know? And yet we have Cassiodorus's grandfather went on an embassy to the court of Attila, several others. No, not Attila, that's Priscus. So there's like 5 or 6 diplomatic missions that we know of to the Huns. We don't get in the sources any Hunnic expeditions the other way, but presumably those things are happening because the Huns seem to know exactly what's going on in the Roman Empire.
You raise a fascinating point there, Murray, because I've always been intrigued as I'm writing my books about the sort of Judeo-Claudian period. so often you'll find that there's a campaign, and for example, I'm thinking Marcus Agrippa, and there's a revolt in Pannonia, for example, and then he goes off. And somehow or other, these people find that Marcus Agrippa is in the area, and they basically say, "Oh, so you don't want to pick a fight with you." Or they find out that Augustus is going to be in Gaul in 1617 BC, and they said, "Oh, no, we'll hand back our hostages." I don't know how does that happen? Is that because there are deputations?
Well, it's very topical in Australia right now because we've got an unnamed politician who's been named as a spy, but they're not naming the politician. So that idea that you could quite easily have people who are duped and give away information without knowing it. You could have the oldest trade in the book, finding out secrets from men and women who talk to their wives, or betrayals, but innocent as well. But I think that it's a two-way street, and to the point that in 367 you have the barbarian conspiracy, which is framed that way by Ammianus, that the barbarians conspire together to all revolt at once. And so, and it's dismissed by a lot of modern historians, like, no, there wouldn't have been anywhere near the coordination. You're like, I think you'll be surprised. I think there's trade clearly going on, for bronze in Europe. Generally speaking, Cornwall is still your best source of tin, and therefore there's a huge amount of trade with Cornwall. For amber, which is everywhere and always the best source of amber throughout Europe is the Baltic. So there's amber trade routes, there's tin, and who knows what else trade routes. Famously in Pliny, there's the expedition under Nero to the coast of the Baltic to bring back enough amber to decorate the amphitheater. So that's, there is all sorts of networks that we don't really think about enough.
There's also personal networking. I mean, in terms of, if you think about, comes to mind with the Allobroges in southern Gaul, that when you've got the Cicero's consulship here and you've got the Catiline conspiracy underway, and of course that gets broken when somebody makes the mistake of trying to rope in the Allobroges. And of course, what do? Who do they turn to? They've actually got a patron in Rome who is linked to their tribe and, is the spokesman for their tribe in Rome. And of course, that sort of then highlights the fact that it's not just, patronship is not just limited to probably within the Roman, within Roman Italy as such, but it's extending out in terms of a network. And of course, you've then got, if you go to Britannia and you think about the Iceni rebellion and talk about, okay, part of the reason for that was, the loans being recalled, and of course loan arrangements had been made with certain individuals in Rome. There are personal networks being forged here, and of course personal politicians also playing a bit of a game in terms of having these networks themselves. So there's information going back and forth that doesn't come through in the official correspondence as such.
The Iceni revolt's fabulous because that's basically private Roman bankers messing with military campaigns. So Suetonius Paulinus is off, defeating Mona, and depending, because Tacitus tells us the violation of the daughters and Boudica herself, and Diotasius doesn't mention that. He only mentions the dodgy loans being recalled. So it's a financial revolt. And so, but that completely messes up the whole military campaign, and they didn't see the revolt coming, that, Boudica and her forces are able to take Camidulum, and then Londinium doesn't get mentioned. It's not important enough. Two important cities get sacked, according to Suetonius, and he's meaning Verulamium and Camidulum. So Colchester and St. Albans, not London, not important enough.
I think Londinium gets mentioned in terms of the getaway plan of Catustechianus, when he decides when it's time to run.
Suetonius's summation is, doesn't even name Boudica, and it just says two important cities got sacked.
Well, I suspect he mentions those because one's a Colonia and the other one's a Municipium. The other one has no status.
London has no status at that point in time. So yeah, exactly. But that sort of idea, and again, coming back to that idea of reacting on the hoof, so to speak, Suetonius Paulinus has to plan that campaign lightning fast, because the planning up Watling Street to conquer Mona, that's been going great. And then all of a sudden you've been thrown a curveball, which, coming back to Lindsay's point about everyone knowing what they're doing, that idea that, no plan lasts contact with the enemy, that as soon as the enemy are in all those plans go out and you do. And so there you have to rely on doxopraxy, really, that you need to do orthopraxy. You have to rely on what you know to do, and your units and your sub-commanders know their role.
But even then, you get the non-appearance of the Second Legion from Exeter, and of course, doesn't really. I mean, okay, we've got the information that the legate takes his own life at the end out of shame of thwarting his men's ability to answer the call, whatever that call was. But
and it's also interesting. Petilius Cerealis recovers because he, loses reputation during the revolt, but he becomes emperor becomes governor in 70. So within 9 years he can turn it around and be top dog. So it's a really interesting, because several of the people there, obviously Agricola most famously, but Frontinus as well, are later emperors, but having been legates of legions earlier in their careers. So, those sorts of challenges are interesting because you've got the pre-planning and then the immediate, get the men into action, and but what if that goes wrong? Well, so all of those sorts of challenges.
That takes another aspect of management and leadership, doesn't it? Which is to motivate. And of course, Julius Caesar has that in bucket loads and spades. But many other people who've got names in the history books don't. They just disappear. And you could say that Quintilius Varus is one of those people, for example.
I think, again, though, like Pompey can clearly motivate his troops, and his troops are motivated to be with him.
He's taken a long learning curve, though. I mean, if you go back to, is it Lorium in Spain, and of course his great call of bring the women and children out to watch an expert lesson in how to govern your troops and annihilate your enemy. And of course, he loses control of it when, of course, his foraging troops are cornered by Sertorius and his Scutati, the Iberian troops that he's got with him. And of course, they're cornered. Pompey goes to the rescue, but can't because he's pinned in his location by the fact that Sertorius hasn't actually moved from his original camp outside the walls of Lorium. And in the end, Pompey is forced to retreat because of a lack of supplies, and also being pinned in a corner. So eventually he does well, but yeah,
a bit like the crowds. The crowds at the Battle of Balaclava. Wait, what are we seeing? Is this how this was meant to go? But I think Sertorius is an interesting one because Sertorius is such a great general, and despite being a rebel, the later literature admires his generalship, which is very unusual to admire a traitor, so to speak. So there's this really unusual relationship to the source material admiring how good a general Sertorius was. And there's a sort of an unspoken, what a pity he turned against us and rebelled. But there's lots of anecdotes of his superior generalship. And I think that's probably what Pompey, unfortunately, more than once in his career came up against.
It's a challenge, the challenge of finding yourself confronted by a better general.
I think any general, knowing your opponent, and, again, we're getting into Sun Tzu, the idea that what your enemy general is going to do. And I think it's something that Alexander takes advantage of in all of his battles against the Persians and Darius, is he knows what the Persian deployment will be. He knows where Darius will be. It's not that he has to spot him on the battlefield. It's that, well, he's going to be behind the Immortals. There's the Immortals. Right. I'll move to the right and thereby create a gap in the Persian line when they try and counter my move to the right. And then I'll charge into that gap. And he does it, at least twice. And it's sort of that sort of idea of, and I think also Cannae is the great example of Hannibal knowing exactly the way that the Roman generals will fight against him and using that to his advantage. And I think, again, we don't tend to credit I think it happens at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 and at various other battles, but that idea that, and again, broken record, the Romans losing the battle isn't the same as the enemy winning the battle, that they won it because they knew what the Romans would do, because the Romans had become so predictable in terms of their deployment, in terms of their tactics. So just like Sertorius and Laurium, you can have that idea of, I know what you're going to do, and I'm going to build a force to specifically deal with exactly what you're going to do.
If I could follow up on your mention of Hannibal, what was it about Hannibal that enabled him to keep an army of so many thousands of mercenaries drawn from many different parts of the Mediterranean and beyond. They were loyal to him, largely until the bitter end. And you could even say that about the force that followed Hamilcar in Sicily a generation earlier. That is, was it the magnetic force of both Hannibal and Hamilcar that kept the men loyal? Because in that case, I mean, because if you think about the campaign that Hannibal had in Italy, for the most part, after Cannae, I mean, with some exceptions, it was basically holding on to a handful of cities in the far south, but he still managed to hold on there until Carthage itself was threatened. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
There are two dimensions to that. One is clearly those men were very charismatic and they were highly respected. That there must have been great promises made for spoils and loot and money. But I think there's another pragmatic, which is when they finally are in Italy, they've gone through the journey. How are they going to get back? Right. So they're fully committed now. They have to make this thing work. And I think that's why they stick with the man that's still around, that still apparently has the charisma and the generalship to lead what he's got. His fatal mistake, of course, he never used his victories, as his own brother told him, and spent 15 years traipsing up and down Italy to no effect.
It's also interesting, though, that there are lots of other armies which use mercenaries that turn on their employer and go, well, actually, we can get the loot for ourselves. We don't need you, or go, we'll fight for the enemy because they've made us a better offer. Mid-battle, we'll betray you. And, Belisarius deals with that problem where he's told that his Hunnic horse archers have been offered a better deal by the Vandals, and that the locals are also, hedging their bets. And he only convinces them through victory that he's the one to follow. But that idea is also peculiar because, armies keep using mercenaries despite the threats and the risks of using mercenaries turning against you or not, not earning their keep, so to speak. So it must come back to not just charisma and following. And that, I think, comes back to Sertorius, the religious justification of their leadership in a concrete way. And Sertorius is interesting because I think it's also about the fact that he's a rebel, that he has the gods on his side. So it really doesn't matter which side he is on politically, the gods favor him. And I think
he also creates the politics of it as well. I mean, his mimicking of Roman structure, both in terms of his forces and also of the political entity that he creates in Spain. He's got the hearts and souls of his soldiers because he's saying to the Romans, I am going to build here what should be in Rome and what, if the Civil War hadn't gone the wrong way, we would have in Rome. And at the same time, he's got this dual message of this is what I'm going to give to Rome. But at the same time, to the Allies, this is what an ideal Roman diplomat and Roman foreign commander would actually do with his allies. And I'm going to demonstrate that to you. So it's a great political sell.
Yeah, every breakaway empire from Rome, whether it be Britain or Gaul or, they do exactly the same thing, that they either say, this is the way we should be being led and we're not, or I'm going to do what the Roman emperors should be doing and protect you and keep you safe. And they then emphasize continuity with Rome, even to the point of, is it Electus or Carausius that issues coins with the three heads of the emperors, the Eastern Emperor, the Western Emperor, and me.
Yeah, it's rather sui. Yes,
we're still Roman.
Yeah, but I think you're right. You're also something that, Murray, that certainly Hannibal, drilled in by his dad, had a sort of religious drive that at least motivated him. I suppose the question is how much that then actually motivated the others. On the flip side, what's interesting when you read Livy, as the Roman campaign gets worse and worse and worse, the city of Rome becomes highly religious. They start turning to getting religion and so on. So it's certainly a factor.
Well, in the Marcomannic Wars, there's, the story we get is of Glaucon, this charlatan, or Alexander, the false prophet, goes with the army to Carnuntum from, Anatolia. But because there's been the plague come back from the Persian Wars of Lucius Verus, and it's still up there with the most deadly pandemics ever to affect the world, I think the estimate is 1 in 10 die. That's huge. But of course, the vexations from all the legions go back to all their camps around Europe. So the plague just goes everywhere. There's every number of, there's lustrums everywhere. I'll bring in this religious figure. They can make their prayers. Those guys can make their prayers. They can make their prayers. So there's lots of trying to counter the not only the superstitions of the city of Rome and the troops, but also actually trying to get a fix. And so you get the story that Alexander the false prophet, who Lucian lambasts in his essay, goes and makes a prediction about who's going to win the battle across the Danube, and gets it so wrong that there's a massacre of 20,000 Roman troops. Now, that's not mentioned in Dio Cassius or any other fragment. It's mentioned in Lucian's essay, so people don't believe it because that's not where you go for military history. But then it's corroborated by Ammianus Marcellinus 200 years later. So you're like, oh, so hang on. So when he said you should throw 2 lions into the Danube and then they will swim across the river like the victorious Roman legions, and so the lions jump into the river, they get out on the other side and then are clubbed to death by the barbarians. And so they then invade and then they destroy 20,000 Roman legionaries. So, it's like, oh, that didn't go well. But that idea of why is this religious figure here? What are they doing with the army? And the idea is, of course, that when the Roman army was in the East, that cult became very popular in the Roman army. And they've essentially agitated to have that figure come and be with them in the West. And then you get the peculiar idea at the Battle of the Miracle of the Rain in around about 174 AD, that there's all sorts of religious figures. There's an Egyptian wizard, but the Christians claim responsibility for bringing the rain at the moment that the Romans needed it. And so, it's not just, it's a Christian miracle, which is how it's presented in later Christian tradition. And it is in fact, no, I think you would find that there is every religion reflected present with the army for all of these other reasons. And probably all of them claim responsibility, because one version has it's Marcus Aurelius praying, the other has the Egyptian priest praying, and the most famous tradition is that it's the Christian soldiers who bring the rain. But in that tradition, they skew it towards, well, it's our responsibility. This is 174 AD. There's no way publicly that any Christian would have ever claimed responsibility. And it's only in letters that survive that we get that.
And it's nothing new at that stage as well.
No, absolutely not.
It says really interesting things about the influence of the rank and file upon how the army operates instead of the general.
Yeah, that challenge of placating the men, not just I'll be a strong leader. It's like, well, I've got this guy, we've got these guys who I know you really like. Look, there's apples, I've cut up some oranges for half time. All of that sort of bizarre and very fickle minutiae seem to come in, but we only get, an anecdote from a single battle in the 2nd century AD.
But it sort of leads into the 3rd century where armies go, no, our general is now the emperor.
Oh, yeah. The 4th century, not you. No, you last a day. Right. Him. No, he lasts a week. So what are they doing? What are they doing wrong? Or what are they doing right? And that's, anyway, but challenges, all challenges.
I know. I was just going to say, it's nothing new by that stage. Go back to the 1st century and, start of the 1st century BC, and you've got Marius toting around a wise woman at some of his battles. And of course, on the other side of the Civil War, you've got Sulla, who's got a small icon that he consults and has speak to him, very much like, one of the early kings of Rome. Have his personal spirit guide as such. So that again, it's that perception that's being sold out to the troops of your commander has a secret advantage that is only accessible to him.
And the guy I'm writing about right now, Tiberius, was an astrologer, a practitioner of mathematics, as he would call it, and Thrasyllus was his great friend. So it's funny that these are things where people effectively, what they're trying to do is predict and forecast but they do it through these unusual media, whereas what we tend to do it through intelligence and modeling and game theory and all the rest of it. But I mean, they're trying to deal with this stuff in the way they know how.
Yeah, I was doing some stuff recently on dies nefasti, the black days, the unlucky days, and it's surprising how few there are. And some of them we don't know the date. We kind of guess the date, but we don't actually have the date. And there's only a couple that we're actually given the specific date. And so you have the Elia, you have Cannae, the Claudes Variana, but then you've also got what's just the battle?
There would also be the Claudes Loliana too, by the way.
Yeah, but there's only about 3 or 4 of them, and you get the idea. Even 69, Tacitus tells us, that Vitellius tries to conduct public business on the 18th of July, which is the Dies Alianis, and so it's like full idiot, and so of course it failed. But then you have the weird one of Lucullus fighting a Battle of Arausio is the other one, and you have Lucullus fighting against Tigranes on the same day as the Battle of Arausio was fought, but he wins. So he knows that it's an unlucky day, is told that it's an unlucky day, but fights anyway and wins. So that kind of like, does his victory in 67 negate
Offset
the loss in 105?
I saw something completely different, a review of a new book about German panzer generals in 1941 today, where there were 2 chapters. One was all based, or a lot of it was based on the letters that they wrote to their wives. So you get, on one hand, they had sort of the internal, what was going on in their heads, and then another chapter about the image that they projected to the troops and to the National Socialist state and all that stuff, and the enormous contrast between the two. And the discussion like this, it makes you wistful that we don't have that for some of these generals, because it'd be very interesting to know all these totems or supports that they carry around, if that's just for public consumption or that they have their own ideas about them.
But even those some of the similarities that have remained through military service, whether you talk about the Oriflame or Nazi Germany had the blood flag from the 1923 Munich push, which is missing still, presumed destroyed, but we don't know, the Blutfahne. And then, but even to the idea of a lucky ship, a lucky tank, the name of a tank, being lucky, all those sorts of ideas. And so those sorts of totemic, Bibles that stop bullets, coins that stop bullets, all of those sorts of things seem to remain in the sort of the military mindset all the way through to today.
Well, I think that just shows that despite training, they're people too, right? And they have fears and aspirations, and for all sorts of crazy reasons, whether you're a true believer in the biblical texts or other things, that's where people find themselves grounded. If that's where if they have that with them, they can do these other things. And famously, Augustus had, I think, was it like a ferret's tail or something like this? It wouldn't be anywhere without it. And it seems ridiculous that a man running an empire would do that, but it's very human.
Running an empire is a dangerous thing. Not as dangerous as going to war, but pretty close. I was actually thinking if there are any more newer examples or younger examples of endangering a standard and a unit standard, like we started our discussions with. I couldn't think of any, but I might very well be wrong. But perhaps that's something for the comments.
The only one I can think of is that during the mutiny in AD 14, is Germanicus is under threat, and the troops actually break into the Principia and threaten, as I understand it, to take the standards. So there's some kerfuffle over that. I don't remember the details, but there is that.
I meant like post ancient.
Oh, post ancient.
Post ancient example.
There's the story of the attempt to rescue the battle flags at Isandlwana. But that makes sense. I mean, they are endangered and they need to be taken away. Yeah, Kandahar as well.
On purpose, trying to, here's the king's color, throw it at the Zulus, go get it.
I suppose those last stands, Kandahar and is it Kandahar, 1842? Gandamak. Oh, brain. Where the small clump of ever shrinking British soldiers is always going to the standard. So in a way, yes, because that's the standard's job. But in another way, rather than breaking and trying to make it on your own or feigning death or whatever, that idea that the last remnants of the troops go to defend the standard, which still flies, that idea is similar, that the standard is in danger.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And I think that those standards have the same function, except I can't think of any events in more modern history where the standard was purposely endangered. Like we were saying earlier, that the ensign runs ahead of the unit and goes, "Follow me or lose your flag." Anyway, that's completely beyond our remit. Now we should probably call it quits because we've been
I was about to say,
I
think there are several examples during the Vietnam War of the Vietnamese putting their flag into danger, attacking American forces.
Well, I could argue, of course, the national anthem that I sing with my fellow countrymen here on a regular basis, of course, is about a flag that got shot at by the British, and it's still there.
That goes for more flags, I think. Well, but that one is really big.
And not really the remit of the Ancient Warfare podcast.
No, not very much, not. But it is impressive. Thank you all. We'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.